Have you ever had this quiet fear that if you change too much, you'll lose yourself, or people will stop recognizing you, or you'll fail again, and feel that familiar shame settle back onto your shoulders? Because that fear is real. And it's not weakness. It's your mind trying to protect you from disappointment. The problem is, protection can become a prison. You start living inside the old identity, not because it's good, but because it's known. And the known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known is slowly breaking you. So when we talk about becoming a new person, I don't mean a dramatic makeover. I don't mean a loud announcement. I don't mean pretending the past never happened. I mean something quieter and far more powerful. Building a new identity through small, repeatable actions until your brain has no choice but to accept the truth. You've changed. Modern psychology keeps circling around the same idea. People don't change because they discover the perfect method. They change because they change what they repeatedly do. And what you repeatedly do becomes who you are. Not in theory, in practice, in your nervous system, in your self-respect, in the way you make decisions when you're tired and nobody is watching. That's the promise of this episode. 10 practical steps, not to create a perfect version of you, but to create a reliable one, a calmer one, a stronger one, someone who doesn't need motivation to show up, because showing up becomes part of their identity. And we're going to keep this simple on purpose because complexity is a beautiful excuse. It makes you feel productive without forcing you to act. Simplicity is different. Simplicity demands you do something. It doesn't let you hide behind ideas. So as you listen, don't try to take all 10 steps at once. Just notice which one makes you uncomfortable. That discomfort is useful. It's your old self protecting its territory. And if you can face that moment, without drama, without self-hate, then you're already becoming the new person you've been imagining. 1. Define your new identity. Have you ever tried to change your life by chasing a goal, only to feel motivated for a week, then slowly drift back into the same patterns like gravity pulling you to an old version of yourself? That's because goals are external. They sit out there in the distance. They can inspire you, but they can't hold you when your mood collapses. Identity is different. Identity sits inside you. It becomes the voice that answers the small question you face 100 times a day. What do I do next? And that's why the first step to becoming a new person is not picking a bigger goal. It's choosing a clearer identity. Because you don't rise to the level of what you want. You fall to the level of who you believe you are. Most people don't realize how often they repeat quiet identity statements in their mind. They say things like, I'm just not disciplined, or I always mess things up, or I'm not the kind of person who can stick to routines, or I'm not confident, or I'm too lazy, or I'm bad at consistency. They say it casually, they say it like it's a personality trait, but it's not. It's a story that has been rehearsed so many times that it feels like truth. And the brain treats repeated stories like instructions, so if you want a new life, you have to stop living under the old sentence. Now, here's the key that makes this practical instead of motivational. Identity is not something you announce. It's something you practice. It's not a poster on the wall. It's a standard you return to when you're tempted, tired, bored, or emotional. Stoicism has a clean way to frame this. Epictetus said that what matters is what is in your control, your judgments, your choices, your actions. In other words, your identity is not what you feel, it's what you choose. You can't always control the first impulse, but you can train the second thought. You can't always control what happens, but you can control how you respond. That's identity. And Marcus Aurelius lived this idea in a way that's almost uncomfortable because it removes excuses. He didn't tell himself, I'll be good when life is easy. He told himself, in effect, my job is to do the right thing now. That's identity, a commitment to a way of being, not a wish for a certain outcome. So what does it actually mean to define your new identity? It means you pick one sentence that describes who you are becoming, and you make sure it's grounded in behavior. Not, I'm rich, that's an outcome. Not, I'm famous, that's external. Not, I'm perfect, that's fantasy. You choose something like, I'm a person who keeps promises to myself. Or, I'm a person who trains even when it's short. Or, I'm a person who tells the truth and keeps my standards. Or, I'm a person who starts tasks before I feel ready. Or, I'm a person who protects my focus. Or, I'm a person who responds calmly under pressure. These identities are powerful because they can be lived today. You don't need permission. You don't need ideal conditions. You just need a moment to choose. And here's the subtle thing. The identity must be specific enough to guide your decisions, but small enough to survive a bad day. A bad day is the real test. Because when you're tired, your mind tries to return to the old identity. It says, see, this is who we are. That's why the new identity can't require heroics. It needs to require direction. A bad day might not allow a full workout, but it can allow 10 minutes. A bad day might not allow deep productivity, but it can allow a clean start. A bad day might not allow perfect calm, but it can allow a pause before reacting. So the identity becomes, I don't do zero, because zero is where the old self wins. Now here's where psychology becomes real. Your brain changes through evidence, not through inspiration, not through speeches. Through evidence. Every action you take is a vote, and the brain adds up votes. If you say, I'm disciplined, but your actions keep voting for comfort, the brain will reject the identity, not because it hates you, but because it's honest. It will say, no, that's not who we are. But if you keep voting, even in small ways, the brain starts to adjust. It starts to update the self-image. It starts to accept the new story because it has proof. So the first practical method is this. Choose your identity, then choose the smallest action that proves it. If your identity is, I'm consistent, the smallest action might be a 5-minute task you do every day, no matter what. If your identity is, I'm athletic, the smallest action might be a daily walk or a short set of push-ups. If your identity is, I'm focused, the smallest action might be 10 minutes with your phone in another room. If your identity is, I'm calm, the smallest action might be one slow breath before you respond to something irritating. This is how identity becomes real, not by declaring it, but by proving it. Now, the next mistake people make is they choose too many identities. They try to become 10 different people at once, but identity is like a muscle. You train one movement until it becomes natural, then you add another. So pick one identity that would change your life the most. And you'll know which one that is because it will scare you a little. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way. You'll feel resistance. You'll feel the old voice saying, don't set yourself up. That resistance is the doorway. Because the identity that threatens the old self is the one that matters. Now here's the moment that seals it. You need a sentence you can use in real time. Not, I'm becoming disciplined. That's soft. Use, I am the kind of person who, bow. Because that structure forces clarity, and then you live it through one action. And when you mess up, and you will, because you're human, you don't collapse back into the old identity. You correct quickly. You return to the standard. You prove again. One vote doesn't define you. The pattern defines you. So here's a clean if. Then, that makes this practical today. If you catch yourself saying an old identity sentence, I'm lazy, I never stick to things, I'm just not disciplined, then replace it immediately with a new identity sentence and do one small action that supports it. Not tomorrow, now. Because the fastest way to break an old story is to interrupt it with evidence. And once you do this for long enough, something changes that feels almost peaceful. You stop needing motivation. You stop needing pep talks. You stop needing the perfect moment. Because you're not chasing a goal anymore. You're living as a person. And that's the foundation of becoming new. 2. The 1% rule. Small improvements that actually stick. Have you ever promised yourself a big change, felt fired up for a moment, and then watched that fire fade? Not because you didn't care, but because the plan demanded a version of you that didn't exist yet. That's the trap. Most people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they try to jump too far ahead of their own nervous system. They make the first step so heavy that the old self can defend itself with one simple argument. This is too much. And once that argument wins a few times, you don't just lose momentum, you lose trust in yourself. You start to believe the story, I don't stick to things. And then every new attempt feels like a setup. The 1% rule is a quiet rebellion against that cycle. It's not about being timid, it's about being strategic. It's choosing a level of change that your mind can't easily reject, and then repeating it long enough that the change stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like just what I do. Because the truth is, your brain doesn't update its identity from one heroic day. It updates from evidence. Tiny evidence, repeated, until the old story becomes harder to believe than the new one. This is why small improvements are not small, they're just small in the moment. Over time, they become a new direction, a new rhythm, a new baseline, and the baseline is everything, because what you do on normal days is what you become. Stoicism fits perfectly here, because Stoicism is not a mood, it's a practice. Epictetus didn't teach people to wait for inspiration. He taught them to train the parts of themselves they actually control, judgment, choice, response, over and over again, in small moments, until those choices became natural. Marcus Aurelius wasn't writing to impress anyone. He was writing to rehearse, to remind himself, to return. That's what 1% is. Returning. Returning to the standard again and again, until the standard is you. Now let's make this real, because improve a little can sound nice and still be useless if it stays vague. A 1% improvement is a change you can complete even when the day goes wrong. It's the minimum version of the habit that still counts as integrity. If you want to become someone who trains, your 1% might be 10 minutes. Not because 10 minutes will transform your body overnight, but because 10 minutes transforms your identity immediately. It proves, I'm the kind of person who doesn't quit just because I'm not in the mood. If you want to become someone who reads, your 1% might be 2 pages. If you want to become someone who focuses, your 1% might be one short block of work with your phone far away. If you want to become emotionally steady, your 1% might be a pause, one breath, before you reply when you feel your ego rising. And here's the moment, to be honest. How many times have you tried to change your life by demanding perfection, then punished yourself when you couldn't maintain it? That punishment is part of why you keep restarting. It trains your brain to associate growth with pain and shame. So the 1% rule also carries a psychological kindness inside it. You make the habit easy enough that you can succeed consistently, because success builds self-trust, and self-trust is fuel that doesn't disappear when motivation does. The most important part is this: you're not lowering your standards. You're lowering the barrier to entry. You're saying, I will always do something, not everything, something, because something keeps the chain alive. And chains matter, not because streaks are magical, but because identity is built by continuity. The old self wins when you do 0, because 0 becomes permission. 0 becomes a door back to the old pattern. But when you do the minimum, you stay in motion. And motion is everything. There's a strange peace that comes from this. You stop needing dramatic fresh starts. You stop needing a perfect Monday. You stop needing to feel ready. You become the kind of person who can have a messy day and still keep a promise. That's strength. Not intensity. Strength. And the deeper truth is this: the goal isn't 1% forever. The goal is 1% until momentum returns naturally. Because once you start, you often do more, but you never demand more as the price of starting. You let the more be a bonus, not a requirement. If you're tired, you do the minimum. If you're energized, you do more. Either way, you don't break the identity. You keep the vote. You keep your word. So here's a clean question to carry with you when you're tempted to quit. What's the smallest version of this habit I can do today that still makes me respect myself? That question is powerful because it brings the decision back to dignity instead of emotion, and dignity lasts longer than motivation. Now make it practical with one simple if-then rule. If you catch yourself thinking, I can't do the full thing today, then you immediately do the minimum version. No negotiation, no delay. You don't argue with your mind. You just complete the smallest proof of your new identity, because the real win is not the size of the habit. The real win is that you didn't abandon yourself. Over time, those small proofs stack up like bricks. And one day, almost without ceremony, you realize something changed. You're not fighting yourself as much. The habit doesn't feel like a battle. It feels like a routine. It feels like you. And that's how a new person is built. Quietly, steadily, by refusing to go back to zero. 3. Change your environment. Make the new you the easy option. Have you ever noticed how you can be completely sincere in the morning, full of good intentions, and then by evening you're doing the same old habits again, almost like you were pulled by something outside your control? That something is often your environment, not just your room, not just your desk. The environment is the full set of cues around you. What you see first, what's within reach, what you're surrounded by, who has access to you, what your phone shows you, what your kitchen makes easy, what your schedule makes inevitable. And if those cues are designed for your old self will keep showing up, even if your mindset is improving. This is one of the most humbling truths in behavioral psychology. Willpower is real, but it's not reliable. It spikes, then fades. It gets tired. It gets emotional. It gets distracted. So if your change depends on willpower alone, your change is fragile. But if your environment quietly supports the new identity, you don't have to fight as much. The right choice starts to feel natural, not because you became superhuman, but because you stopped living inside a trap. Stoicism fits beautifully here, because Stoicism is basically the art of removing unnecessary battles. It's the discipline of asking, what is in my control right now? And one of the most controllable things in your life is what you place in front of your mind all day. Epictetus would remind you that you don't control the first impulse, but you do control what you expose yourself to repeatedly, and repeated exposure becomes habit. Marcus Aurelius would say, in his own way, that the mind takes the shape of what it spends time with. So if you keep feeding it chaos, it will become chaotic. If you feed it clarity, it will become clear. The environment is how you feed the mind, without constantly arguing with it. So step 3 is not about trying harder, it's about making the path smoother. Start with one simple observation. Your habits are often the fastest response to a cue. You don't scroll because you're evil. You scroll because your phone is there, your thumb knows the path, and your brain wants relief. You don't eat junk because you're weak. You eat it because it's visible, available, and it gives instant comfort. You don't procrastinate because you don't care. You procrastinate because your workspace invites distraction. Your tasks feel heavy, and avoidance is the quickest way to feel lighter for a moment. Now, here's a question that cuts through excuses, and it might sting a little. What does your environment currently reward? Does it reward focus or distraction? Does it reward calm or stimulation? Does it reward discipline or convenience? Does it reward the person you're becoming or the person you're trying to outgrow? If you answer honestly, you'll see why you keep slipping. It's not only you, it's what you're living inside. So we redesign quietly, practically, and the best way to do this is not a full life makeover. It's one small environmental shift that produces a big behavioral change. Think like an engineer, not like a motivational speaker. Remove friction from the good habit. Add friction to the bad habit. If you want to become someone who reads, put the book where your phone used to live. Put it on the pillow. Put it on the chair. Put it where your hand naturally reaches at night. At the same time, make scrolling harder. Charge your phone in another room. Log out. Delete one app. Not forever if that feels too dramatic. Just enough friction that the old autopilot stops working smoothly. If you want to become someone who trains, make training the default. Lay out the clothes the night before. Keep a simple routine that requires almost no setup. If the environment requires a long sequence of steps to begin, your brain will bargain. But if the environment says, it's right here, ready, the new identity gets a clean chance. If you want to become someone who eats better, don't start with moral speeches. Start with visibility. Put the healthy food where you can see it. Prepare one simple option in advance. Remove the most tempting trigger foods from immediate reach. You don't need to become a monk. You just need to stop living in a kitchen that's designed to defeat you. If you want to become someone who works with focus, the environment has to protect that focus. Clear the desk. Use one tab. Put the phone out of sight. Create a small ritual that signals work begins now, like a specific chair, a specific drink, a specific time window, a specific playlist if that helps you. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is consistency. You're training a cue-response loop that supports your mission. And now let's talk about a part of environment people don't like to admit. People are part of your environment. Whoever has easy access to you shapes you, whether they mean to or not. If you're surrounded by chronic complainers, your mind starts to complain. If you're surrounded by people who treat growth like a joke, you begin to hide your growth. If you're surrounded by people who constantly distract you, you begin to believe distraction is normal. The Stoic move is not to hate them. It's to manage access. It's to decide how close certain energies get to your mind. This is not arrogance. It's hygiene, and it's also compassion for your future self. Because your future self is the one who pays the bill for your current environment. Now, notice something subtle. When people try to change, they often blame themselves for failing, but they rarely blame the room. They rarely blame the phone setup. They rarely blame the default settings of their life. But defaults are powerful. Most humans live by default. They wake up and the day grabs them. The environment leads, the person follows. Step 3 is you reversing that relationship. You lead, the environment follows. So here's a simple practice that turns this into action without overwhelming you. Do one environment audit today. Not a dramatic clean-out. One audit. Ask yourself, what is one trigger that reliably pulls me into the old self? Maybe it's your phone on the bed. Maybe it's the snacks on the counter. Maybe it's a certain group chat. Maybe it's the TV on by default. Maybe it's the messy workspace. Identify one. Then ask, what is one small environmental change that would make that trigger weaker? Move the phone. Remove the snacks. Mute the chat. Unplug the TV. Clear the desk. One change. Because once you experience the power of one change, you stop relying on motivation. You start relying on design. And design is karma. It doesn't need hype. Here's an if-then that makes this step almost automatic. If you keep failing at the same habit, then stop blaming your character and change the cue. Change what's in front of you. Change what's within reach. Change what's easiest. Make the good habit the lazy habit. Make the bad habit the inconvenient habit. And there's a deeper payoff here. Changing the environment is a form of self-respect. It's you saying, I take my future seriously enough to protect it. It's you admitting, I don't want to fight myself all day. I want to build a life that supports me, because the new person you're becoming shouldn't have to win a war every morning just to do the basics. The new person deserves a home, a schedule, and a digital world that makes discipline feel possible. And when the environment shifts, something almost magical happens. Your identity starts to feel more real, because the world around you is no longer whispering the old story. It's whispering a new one, a quieter one, a stronger one. 4. Take stock of your relationships. Have you ever felt yourself doing well for a few days, focused, calm, disciplined, and then you spend an hour with the wrong person, or you step back into an old group dynamic, and suddenly you're not you anymore? You're a version of you that you thought you outgrew. That experience is so common it almost feels like a law of nature, and in a way it is, because humans are contagious. Not with germs, with mood, with language, with standards, with what we tolerate, with what we joke about, with what we normalize. Your relationships aren't just people in your life. They're a climate your nervous system lives inside, and climates shape behavior. This is why you can have a perfect plan and still collapse if the social environment keeps pulling you back toward your old identity. It's not always direct sabotage. Sometimes it's softer than that. It's the casual dismissal when you talk about changing. It's the constant distractions that make focus feel too serious. It's the subtle guilt when you start setting boundaries. It's the way certain people only recognize the old version of you, so they keep calling him back like a nickname you can't escape. Stoicism has a sharp clarity about this. Seneca wrote, in one famous line, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." And he wasn't being elitist. He was being realistic. He understood that character is shaped in community, and if your community rewards weakness, your weakness grows. If your community rewards discipline, your discipline becomes easier. He even used a harsh metaphor. If you live with a lame man, you will learn to limp. It's blunt, but the point is compassionate. You become what you repeatedly stand next to. So step 4 is not cut everyone off. It's not isolation. It's maturity. It's an audit. It's you asking without drama, who in my life strengthens the person I'm trying to become, and who keeps pulling me back into the person I'm trying to leave behind? And that question matters because relationships can keep you trapped in roles. Some people don't relate to you as a living, changing person. They relate to you as a character in a story they memorized years ago. The funny one, the weak one, the one who always says yes, the one who always fixes things, the one who never finishes, the one who always comes back. And when you start changing, it threatens the whole script. Your growth forces everyone to adjust, and not everyone wants to adjust. So the resistance you feel isn't always personal hatred. Sometimes it's just inertia. It's the social system trying to keep itself stable. But your life is not a system designed to keep other people comfortable. Your life is something you're building. Now here's the tricky part. You can't do this audit purely with your intellect, because socially you'll justify people you should distance from. You'll say, but they mean well, or, but we've known each other forever, or, but they're family, or, but I don't want conflict. And those reasons can be real, but they can also be a cover for fear. The fear of disappointing people, the fear of being judged, the fear of being alone for a moment, the fear of losing a familiar identity, even if it was hurting you. So instead of asking, are they a good person? Ask a more useful question. How do I feel after I spend time with them? Not during, after. Do you feel clearer, calmer, more stable, more motivated to do what matters? Or do you feel agitated, drained, scattered, tempted to escape into old habits, tempted to become smaller, tempted to perform, tempted to people please, tempted to numb yourself afterward? That after feeling is data. That's your nervous system telling the truth without making speeches about it. And you'll notice something else if you pay attention. Certain people don't just take your energy. They take your direction. You can be fine all day. Then you talk to someone who constantly complains or gossips or catastrophizes. And suddenly your mind is thinking in their language. Your imagination turns dark. Your decisions become foggy. Your confidence softens. Not because you're weak, but because you exposed yourself to a mental atmosphere that reshaped your thoughts. That's why a relationship audit is also a mental diet. Now, to do this with integrity, you need to separate people into categories, not with cruelty, but with clarity. There are people who are safe. They respect your boundaries. They don't punish your growth. They don't demand explanations. They don't compete with your progress. They can hear your truth without turning it into gossip. They can disagree without trying to dominate you. They make you feel more like yourself. Those people are rare. Keep them close. Invest in them. They're part of the environment you're designing. Then there are people who aren't evil, but they're misaligned. They live in a different rhythm. They might love constant noise, constant drama, constant stimulation. They might treat discipline like something to mock. They might measure life by social approval. They might want access to you at all times. They might unconsciously punish you when you change because it makes them confront their own stagnation. With these people, you don't need a big confrontation. You simply change the distance. You shorten the time. You reduce the frequency. You stop telling them your plans. You stop trying to get them to understand. You become polite, calm, and less available. And then there are people who actively destabilize you. They provoke, they guilt, they manipulate, they disrespect boundaries. They pull you into chaos and then act innocent when you're exhausted. They make your life feel like an emotional negotiation. With these people, distance is not cruelty. Distance is self-respect. The Stoic idea here is simple. Your peace is part of your responsibility. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that other people will do what they do, but your job is to keep your own mind steady. And that includes choosing the conditions you place your mind in. It's not controlling others. It's controlling your exposure. So what's the practical way to do step 4 without creating unnecessary conflict? You stop announcing changes and you start living them. You don't argue about boundaries, you enforce them. You don't explain why you're less available, you become less available. You don't justify why you're focusing, you focus. You don't try to convert everyone, you choose your circle. And when you do speak, you keep it clean. You don't blame, you don't accuse, you don't lecture. You just name your standard. I'm keeping my evenings quiet. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm focusing on a few things right now. Short, calm, done. Here's a reality that will save you pain. The right people won't demand access to you at the cost of your well-being. They might miss you. They might ask questions, but they won't punish you for protecting your life. The wrong people will treat your growth like betrayal. And that reaction, again, is information. Now, there's also a positive side to this step that people forget. You don't only distance from what drains you, you also move toward what builds you. If you want to become a new person, you need a few future mirrors in your life. People who reflect back the identity you're trying to live. Not perfect people, not people who intimidate you, just people whose presence raises your standards naturally. Sometimes that's a friend who is consistent and calm. Sometimes it's a mentor. Sometimes it's a community around a skill or discipline. Sometimes it's a small group that meets with intention. The point isn't social status. The point is psychological direction. When you're around people who live with clarity, clarity feels normal. When you're around people who live with excuses, excuses start to feel normal, and you get to choose what becomes normal. So here's the if-then that makes this step actionable today. If someone consistently leaves you depleted, tempted to regress, or pressured to perform, then reduce exposure by one notch. Less time, less frequency, less intimacy, less access to your plans. And if someone consistently supports your growth with respect and steadiness, then increase investment by one notch. More honest conversation, more shared time, more mutual standards. Small adjustments, big consequences. Because in the end, becoming a new person isn't only about what you do alone in the morning. It's also about what you allow around you at night. It's what you repeatedly permit into your mind through the people you keep close. And once your relationships stop pulling you backward, something becomes possible. Real self-discipline, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that doesn't need constant willpower, because your life is no longer set up to defeat you. 5. Master self-discipline. Replace motivation with standards. Have you ever had a day where you genuinely knew what you needed to do and still didn't do it, not because you were incapable, but because your mind started negotiating like a skilled lawyer? I'll start later. I'll do it tomorrow. I deserve a break. I'm not in the mood. I'll do it when I feel ready. That negotiation is the invisible force that keeps people stuck. And what's frightening is that it doesn't sound like sabotage. It sounds like reason. It sounds like realism. It sounds like you being understanding with yourself. But most of the time, it's just your old identity protecting itself. It's comfort defending its territory. Self-discipline is not about being harsh. It's about being clear. It's the moment you stop treating your life like a debate. Stoicism helps here because it doesn't ask you to be perfect. It asks you to be responsible. Epictetus would say, you cannot control what you feel first, but you can control what you choose next. And Marcus Aurelius, in his private writing, constantly returned to one idea. Do the work in front of you. Not because you feel like it, because it's yours to do. That's not coldness. That's dignity. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline is intensity. They imagine a heroic personality type, someone who's always fired up, always unstoppable. But discipline isn't a personality. It's a system. It's standards you follow even when your emotions change. And emotions always change. Motivation is a wave. Discipline is a shoreline. The reason motivation fails is simple. It depends on how you feel, and feelings are unstable. A small disappointment can kill motivation. A bad night of sleep can kill motivation. An argument can kill motivation. A boring task can kill motivation. If your transformation depends on motivation, your transformation depends on perfect conditions. But standards don't require perfect conditions. Standards require a decision. So the first thing to do is to stop calling it motivation and start calling it what it is, a standard of behavior. Instead of, I'm trying to work out, it becomes, I train most days. Instead of, I'm trying to focus, it becomes, I protect my mornings. Instead of, I'm trying to eat better, it becomes, I don't keep certain foods in my house. Instead of, I'm trying to stop scrolling, it becomes, my phone sleeps outside my bedroom. This is the shift from inner begging to outer structure. Now, here's where self-discipline becomes practical. You don't need discipline for everything. You need discipline for the first few minutes, because once you start, the mind often cooperates. The real enemy is the beginning. The beginning is where the negotiation is loudest, because the beginning is where the old identity has a chance to stop you before momentum forms. So you create a start ritual so small and automatic that it bypasses negotiation. If you're writing, the ritual might be opening the document and writing one sentence. If you're training, it might be putting on the shoes and doing one set. If you're studying, it might be opening the book and reading one paragraph. If you're cleaning your life up, it might be clearing one surface. If you're trying to build calm, it might be sitting down for one breath and letting your body settle. These small beginnings are not childish. They're intelligent. They trick the brain into motion. And once you're moving, you're no longer negotiating. You're doing. Seneca wrote about how life is short and how we waste it. But the deepest waste isn't only time. It's the repeated waste of potential through delay. Every day you negotiate with yourself, you reinforce the identity of the person who negotiates. That identity becomes heavier. It becomes automatic. Discipline is breaking that identity by creating a new one. I do what I said I would do, even when it's small. And this is where self-trust is built. Because the most painful thing isn't that other people don't trust you. The most painful thing is when you stop trusting yourself. When you say you'll change, and you don't. When you promise yourself you'll start, and you don't. When you tell yourself, this time is different, and then it becomes the same story again. That's not just failure. That's self-betrayal. And repeated self-betrayal creates shame. Discipline is how you heal that shame, not with affirmations but with integrity. You keep promises, small promises, real promises, promises you can actually keep. Because a promise you keep is proof that you're reliable. And reliability is the root of confidence. Now there's also a hard truth in here. Sometimes you don't need more discipline. You need fewer choices. Many people fail because they give themselves too many daily decisions. They wake up and decide everything in real time. When to work, what to eat, whether to train, how to spend the evening. That creates decision fatigue, and decision fatigue creates weakness. So you simplify. You create default rules. You decide in advance. This is why routines are powerful. They remove debate. They remove choice. They turn "should I" into "this is what I do." A Stoic would call this training. You're training the habit of choosing what's right before the moment of temptation arrives. So your discipline becomes preventative, not reactive. Now let's talk about the emotional side of this, because discipline without emotional wisdom can become brittle. When people fail, they often spiral into self-hate. They say, "I'm hopeless." They quit. They binge. They collapse. They punish themselves as if pain will create change. But pain without clarity doesn't create discipline. It creates avoidance. Stoicism offers a cleaner approach, correction without self-attack. If you fail, you don't dramatize it. You don't build an identity around it. You correct. You return. You treat failure like data, not like a verdict. Because the disciplined person isn't the one who never slips. The disciplined person is the one who returns quickly. So here's the practical if-then for step 5. If you feel yourself bargaining, "I'll do it later," "I'll start tomorrow," "I don't feel like it," then you immediately reduce the task to the smallest possible version and begin. Not because the minimum is impressive, but because beginning breaks the spell. The minimum is how you keep your identity intact. And a second if-then that will save you from spirals. If you slip, then you return the same day. Not Monday, not next week, the same day. Even with a tiny action, because returning quickly is what separates a setback from a relapse. Over time, discipline becomes less about force and more about identity. You stop feeling like you're trying. You start feeling like you're simply living according to standards. And those standards become your peace, because they remove the chaos of constant internal debate. And once discipline is in place, something else becomes possible. You stop fearing failure so much, because you see failure differently. You begin to develop a growth mindset, the ability to treat mistakes as training, not as shame. That's where we go next. 6. Develop a growth mindset. Turn failure into training. Have you ever failed at something and immediately felt that old inner voice show up, cold, confident, cruel, saying, "See, this is why you don't try, this is why you can't change, this is who you are"? That voice is dangerous because it doesn't just describe the moment. It tries to define you. It takes one mistake and turns it into an identity. And once failure becomes identity, growth becomes humiliating. You stop experimenting, you stop taking risks, you stop trying new habits. Not because you don't want progress, but because you don't want that feeling, the feeling that your effort is evidence against you. A growth mindset is the ability to refuse that narrative, not with fake positivity, with accuracy, with the understanding that failure is not a verdict. It's feedback, it's data, it's training. And if you can absorb failure without collapsing, you become almost unstoppable. Not because you never fall, but because you stop treating falling as proof that you shouldn't walk. Stoicism has been teaching this for a long time. Epictetus compared life to training in a gym. You don't walk into a gym and lift a heavy weight once, fail, and then conclude, "I'm not the kind of person who can lift." You understand the process. You understand that strength is built through repeated attempts. You understand that the struggle is part of the training. The Stoic sees life the same way. Difficulty is not an insult. Difficulty is the curriculum. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself as if he was constantly recentering after failure. His journal isn't the voice of a man who never struggled. It's the voice of a man who struggled and returned. Again and again. That is growth mindset in action, returning. So step 6 is learning to change how you interpret failure, because interpretation is where most people lose the war. When you fail, you can interpret it as evidence that you're broken, or as evidence that you're learning. The event is the same. The meaning is different, and meaning determines whether you quit or continue. Now, let's be honest, many people secretly fear that if they adopt a growth mindset, they'll become too soft on themselves. They'll excuse everything. They'll never demand excellence. But a real growth mindset is not soft. It's demanding in a smarter way. It says, "I will improve, but I will not insult myself into improvement." Because insult creates avoidance. Shame creates hiding, and hiding kills growth. Growth requires honesty without cruelty. So what does this look like in real life? It looks like failing, then asking a better question. Instead of, "What's wrong with me?" you ask, "What happened?" Instead of, "Why am I like this?" you ask, "What triggered this?" Instead of, "I ruined everything," you ask, "What is the next correct action?" Those questions are not motivational quotes. They are tools. They bring you back into control. And control matters because when people spiral after failure, they usually lose control in 2 ways. They catastrophize and they personalize. Catastrophizing is when one mistake becomes, "I'll never change." Personalizing is when one mistake becomes, "I am a failure." Both are lies. And both are emotional, not rational. The Stoic response is to remove the story and look at the facts. You missed a workout. You ate badly. You wasted 2 hours. You reacted emotionally. You procrastinated. Okay. Those are facts. But facts do not demand self-hate. Facts demand correction. And correction is something you can do. Now, here's a crucial truth. The way you respond to failure trains your brain what failure means. If every failure leads to self-attack, your brain will begin to avoid effort, because effort becomes associated with pain. But if failure leads to reflection and correction, your brain becomes more willing to try. It starts to see failure as safe, which makes learning faster. This is why athletes, artists, and high performers often have a healthier relationship with mistakes. They treat mistakes as part of the process, not as proof they shouldn't be in the game. So your job is to build that relationship. Here's a practical practice that changes everything. Write down in one sentence the lesson each failure is trying to teach you. Not a dramatic essay, one sentence. If you procrastinated, the lesson might be, my task was too vague, I need a clearer first step. If you broke your diet, the lesson might be, I didn't plan a backup meal, so I defaulted to convenience. If you snapped at someone, the lesson might be, I was overstimulated and didn't pause before speaking. If you scrolled for hours, the lesson might be, I was avoiding discomfort and my phone was within reach. That sentence turns failure from shame into strategy, and once you have strategy, you can improve. This also connects directly to discipline. Discipline isn't the absence of failure, it's the speed of recovery. A growth mindset makes recovery faster because it removes the shame loop. The shame loop says, I failed, so I'm worthless, so I might as well keep failing. The growth mindset says, I failed, so I learned something, so I adjust, so I continue. That is a completely different life. Now let's talk about a common psychological trap, comparing your growth to someone else's highlight reel. This kills growth mindset because it makes the process feel humiliating. You think, they're already there, and I'm still struggling. But the Stoic would remind you, the only comparison that matters is you versus your former self. Everyone else is noise. Their timeline is not your timeline. Their life is not your life. Your job is to improve your character, your habits, your focus, your discipline, one honest step at a time, and one more trap, perfectionism. Perfectionism disguises itself as high standards, but often it's just fear of being seen imperfectly. A growth mindset rejects perfectionism because it values progress over image. It says, I will look foolish for a while. It says, I will be a beginner. It says, I will be uncomfortable, because that's how mastery is built. And there's something liberating about that. Once you allow yourself to be a beginner, you become willing to practice. And practice is the only path. Here's the if-then that makes step 6 real. If you fail, then you do 3 things in this order. Name the fact, extract the lesson, take the next small action. Fact, lesson, action. No self-attack in between. And a second if-then that builds resilience. If your mind starts saying, this means I'm not capable, then you answer with one sentence. This means I'm in training, because you are. Over time, this becomes your new default. You stop being afraid of discomfort. You stop being afraid of mistakes. You start trusting that you can handle setbacks without losing yourself. And that trust changes your decisions. You become willing to learn, to take on challenges, to build skills, to expand your identity. Which brings us naturally to the next step, investing in continuous learning, not as a hobby, but as a way to build a new professional and personal identity. That's point 7. 7. Invest in continuous learning, build a new mind on purpose. Have you ever had this moment where you realize the person you want to become isn't blocked by a lack of desire? It's blocked by a lack of skill, a lack of clarity, a lack of tools, and then, almost immediately, you feel the weight of it and think, it's too late, or I'm behind, or I don't even know where to start. That feeling is one of the most expensive lies we tell ourselves because it turns learning into something only the young or the lucky get to do, when in reality, learning is one of the most direct ways to become new. Not in a motivational sense, in a literal sense. Your brain rewires through exposure, repetition, and practice. When you learn consistently, you don't just collect information, you reshape how you think, how you decide, what you notice, what you believe is possible. And there's a Stoic simplicity to this. Seneca warned that life isn't short, we just waste it. And a massive part of that waste is not only time spent doing nothing, but time spent doing the same easy things that keep us the same person. So, continuous learning is you reclaiming your time from the old identity. It's you saying, I'm not going to let my free hours be stolen by distraction. I'm going to turn them into leverage. Because the truth is, most people want a new life while living with the same mind, same inputs, same conversations, same entertainment, same habits of attention, same way of interpreting problems, same comfort-based choices. And then they're surprised the results don't change. A new person requires a new mind, not a different personality overnight, a different mental toolkit, a different set of defaults, a different way of solving problems, and learning is how you install that. Now, the reason learning transforms identity is simple. It creates competence, and competence creates confidence that isn't dependent on praise. When you know you're getting better at something real, writing, communication, coding, sales, fitness science, language learning, design, trade skills, anything, your self-respect starts to rise quietly. You stop needing approval as much because you have something more stable, progress you can measure. Epictetus would say you don't become free by wishing, you become free by training. And training is learning in action. It's the decision to be a student again, not in a classroom sense, but in a life sense. You're willing to be awkward at first. You're willing to not know. You're willing to practice. That willingness alone separates you from most people, because most people would rather protect their ego than expand their ability. So let's make this practical, because learn more can become another vague idea that feels inspiring and changes nothing. The simplest version is this. Choose one skill that matches your new identity and give it a daily time slot that's small enough to protect and big enough to matter. For many people, that's an hour. For some, it's 30 minutes. The number is less important than the consistency, because consistency is what turns knowledge into a new baseline. And here's the key that makes it actually work. You don't learn randomly. You learn with direction. Random learning is entertainment. Directed learning is identity building. So you choose a lane, one lane, not 10 lanes. If your new identity is, I'm a focused professional, maybe that lane is a career skill, data analysis, coding, design, marketing, public speaking, sales, project management. If your new identity is, I'm calm and capable, maybe that lane is emotional regulation, communication, negotiation, psychology, or leadership. If your new identity is, I'm strong and disciplined, maybe that lane is strength training fundamentals, nutrition basics, mobility, or recovery science. The lane doesn't need to impress anyone. It needs to serve the person you're becoming. Now, a lot of people hesitate here because they think learning has to be perfect. They imagine they must find the best course, the best teacher, the best plan, and they delay for weeks searching. That's just procrastination wearing a suit. The Stoic move is to begin with what's available and improve the system later. Start messy, refine later. Start simple, deepen later. And platforms like Coursera and Udemy can help because they remove friction. They give structure. They give a path. But what matters most isn't the platform. It's your agreement with yourself that learning is no longer optional. It's part of who you are. It's a daily vote for your future. Now, here's where this becomes emotionally powerful. Consistent learning changes the way you see yourself in the mirror. Because every day you show up to learn, you're telling your mind, I'm not stuck, I'm not finished, I'm not trapped inside my past. And the mind begins to relax its old identity grip. You start to feel lighter. Not because life is easy, but because you have movement, you have direction. You're no longer waiting for rescue. You're building. But you have to protect it, because learning requires attention, and attention is under attack all day. So the real discipline isn't intellectual, it's environmental and emotional. It's you choosing a time and place where learning actually happens. It's you closing the tabs. It's you putting the phone away. It's you tolerating the discomfort of not being instantly entertained. And that discomfort matters. Because learning is often boring at first. It's slow, it's humbling, it doesn't give quick dopamine like scrolling does. So when you commit to learning daily, you're also retraining your brain to tolerate depth. You're teaching it that not everything needs to be fast and flashy to be valuable. That alone makes you sharper in every part of life. Your thinking, your decisions, your patience, your confidence. So here's a powerful way to frame it. You're not studying, you're forging a new identity, and identity is forged in repetition. Now, a practical if-then to make this stick. If you feel resistance before your learning session, boredom, doubt, laziness, what's the point? Then you commit to just 10 minutes, not as a trick, but as a doorway. 10 minutes gets you started, and once you start, your mind usually settles. And if after 10 minutes you still truly can't continue, you stop without shame. But you keep the identity intact. You showed up, you voted, you stayed in the game. And another if-then that raises the quality. If you finish a learning session, then you write or say one sentence that captures what you learned, and one sentence that names how you'll apply it. Learning becomes real when it changes behavior. Even a tiny application, a small action, a small test, a small adjustment turns knowledge into identity. Over time, this step creates something rare. A person who doesn't fear the future because they know they can adapt. They know they can learn. They know they can upgrade their mind. And in a world that keeps changing, that is a kind of security that can't be taken from you. And once learning becomes part of your identity, you naturally start noticing another truth. Your mind can only be as stable as the body carrying it. That's why the next step is radical care of the body, not as vanity, but as the foundation of mental strength. 8. Radical care for your body. Make health non-negotiable. Have you ever noticed how the same problem feels completely different, depending on whether you slept well the night before? When you're rested, you can think, you can pause, you can choose, you can handle discomfort without collapsing into impulse. But when you're exhausted, everything becomes heavier, your emotions get louder, your patience gets shorter, your cravings get stronger, your willpower feels like it's leaking out of you. This is why taking care of your body isn't a health goal. It's an identity decision. It's a discipline decision. It's a mental clarity decision. Because the mind does not float above the body like some separate machine. The mind is carried by the body. And when the body is neglected, the mind becomes reactive, foggy, impatient, and easier to hijack. Stoicism understood this in a grounded way. The Stoics weren't anti-body. They were anti-indulgence. They believed in temperance, not as punishment, but as freedom. When you can govern your appetite, you can govern your life. When you can tolerate discomfort, you can tolerate growth. When you respect your body, you stop needing cheap escapes every time you feel stress. So step 8 is radical care. Not because you're trying to look perfect, because you're trying to become stable. And radical here doesn't mean extreme workouts and complicated diets. It means non-negotiable fundamentals, the basics you protect even when life is chaotic. Because the basics are what keep you from turning into someone you don't recognize. Start with sleep, because sleep is the foundation you can't replace with discipline. People love to romanticize grinding, but the truth is brutal. A tired brain will always bargain. A tired brain will call self-sabotage self-care. A tired brain will turn small stress into drama. A tired brain will reach for sugar, scrolling, and emotional reactions because it wants relief. So make sleep a standard, a protected boundary, not just, I hope I sleep better. Something clearer. For example, a consistent wake time, a screens down moment, and a simple wind down routine. Not glamorous, effective. If you change nothing else but your sleep consistency, your entire personality begins to shift. You become calmer without trying. Your cravings soften. Your emotional control improves. Your capacity for focus expands. The new identity suddenly has room to breathe. Then comes nutrition, not as obsession, but as stability. Most people treat food like mood management. They eat to escape. They eat to reward themselves. They eat to numb anxiety. And when they do that, they think they have an eating problem. But often what they have is a nervous system problem. Food becomes the fastest way to alter emotional state. So the goal isn't to become perfect. The goal is to stop using food as emotional medicine. The simplest way to do that is to reduce decisions. Have a few repeatable meals you can rely on, meals that give you stable energy without chaos. When you remove daily food decisions, you remove a huge amount of mental friction. That's discipline disguised as simplicity. Then, movement. Your body was not designed to sit still with constant stimulation. Movement is not only about fitness, it's about mental health. It's about giving your nervous system a clean release. It's about taking stress that's trapped in your body and turning it into something useful. And you don't need to become a fanatic. You need a minimum standard you keep. A walk most days, a few strength sessions a week, mobility if your body feels tight. Something consistent enough that your body begins to trust you again. Because here's the truth. Your body's listening. It remembers how you treat it. When you ignore it, it gets louder in painful ways. When you respect it, it gives you energy back quietly. And now we get to the deeper part of this step. Changing your identity requires a nervous system that can handle discomfort. Most people don't relapse because they forgot what to do. They relapse because they feel discomfort, boredom, loneliness, anxiety, pressure, and their body looks for an escape. If you train your body to handle discomfort through sleep, movement, and stable nutrition, you become less desperate for escape. You become less impulsive. You become more capable of staying with the hard moment without needing to run. That's why this is radical care. It changes your relationship with discomfort. And it also changes your relationship with self-respect. Because every time you choose sleep over late-night stimulation, you tell yourself, I'm worth protecting. Every time you choose a nourishing meal over a self-destructive binge, you tell yourself, I'm someone who doesn't abandon myself. Every time you move your body when you feel heavy, you tell yourself, I'm building strength, not excuses. These are not health tips. These are identity votes. Now, a lot of people struggle here because they treat health as all or nothing. If they can't do a perfect week, they do nothing. That's the old identity talking. The new identity says minimum standards consistently. So choose the simplest non-negotiables. A consistent wake time, a daily movement minimum, a repeatable nutrition default. And protect those three like they're the foundation of your future, because they are. Here's a practical if-then to make this step real. If you feel your discipline collapsing, then check your body first. Ask, am I underslept, underfed, overstimulated, undermoved? Because often the motivation problem is a biology problem. Fix the body and the mind becomes cooperative again. And here's another if. Then that makes it sustainable. If you miss a day, then you return to the minimum the next day, without punishment. No dramatic restart, no guilt, just return. The body learns trust through consistency, not through intensity. Over time, this step gives you something that is hard to explain until you feel it, a stable baseline. You're not constantly fighting yourself. You're not constantly craving escape. You have energy, you have clarity, you have emotional space. And once your body is cared for, you can finally do the next step with more depth. Mindfulness, not as a trend, but as a way to see your automatic thoughts before they become automatic decisions. 9. Practice mindfulness. Catch the old self before it takes the wheel. Have you ever had that unsettling moment where you realize you didn't decide to do something? You just did it. You picked up your phone without thinking. You snapped at someone before you even understood why. You ate something you promised yourself you wouldn't. You avoided the work, then later, you couldn't even explain what you were avoiding. That's the old self in its most powerful form, not as a dramatic identity, but as an autopilot. And autopilot is dangerous because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like life happening to you. Mindfulness is how you take life back from autopilot. Not by becoming some perfectly calm person who never struggles. Mindfulness is simpler than that. It's the ability to notice what's happening inside you in real time. Your thoughts, your urges, your emotions, before they harden into behavior. It's the moment you see the impulse rising and you say, "Ah, there it is." And in that small moment of seeing, you regain the ability to choose. Stoicism is basically mindfulness with moral purpose. Epictetus taught that events don't control you, your judgments do. But how do you change judgments if you don't even notice them? Marcus Aurelius constantly trained himself to watch his mind, to separate what happened from the story he was tempted to tell about it, to see anger as a wave that rises and falls, to see fear as a prediction, not a fact. That practice is mindfulness. It's observation without instant obedience. So step 9 is building the habit of awareness, because without awareness, all the other steps become harder. You can define identity, improve habits, redesign environment, choose relationships, build discipline, learn, care for the body. But if you keep living unconsciously, the old patterns will still sneak in through the back door. And the back door is usually emotion. Most self-sabotage isn't logical. It's emotional. You don't scroll because you decided it's good for you. You scroll because you felt stress, boredom, loneliness, or pressure, and your brain wanted relief. You don't procrastinate because you enjoy it. You procrastinate because starting feels uncomfortable. You don't lash out because you love conflict. You lash out because you felt threatened. So mindfulness gives you something powerful. You start noticing the emotional trigger before the behavior. You begin to see the sequence. Trigger, urge, action, regret. Mindfulness interrupts the sequence between urge and action. That's the entire game. And we can make this practical with 2 tools that are simple enough to use daily: short meditation and journaling. You don't need both forever. You can choose one. The point is creating a daily space where you practice observing your mind instead of being dragged by it. Meditation is like strength training for attention. It teaches you to sit with discomfort, notice distraction, return to the breath, return to the present, without drama. And the benefit isn't mystical. The benefit is that you get better at returning. You get better at not being kidnapped by every thought. You build the muscle of coming back. Journaling is like shining a flashlight into the mind. When you write, you slow the mind down. You turn vague anxiety into clear sentences. You expose patterns. You see what you keep repeating. You see what you're avoiding. And when you see it on paper, it stops being this invisible fog that controls you. It becomes something you can work with. Now, here's what most people do wrong. They treat mindfulness as something they do only when life is calm. But mindfulness is meant for the messy moments. It's meant for the exact moments when you're tempted to react, because that's when your identity is being tested. So a simple daily practice might look like this: a few minutes in the morning to observe your mind, and a few minutes at night to reflect. Not to judge yourself, to understand yourself. The goal isn't to become perfect. The goal is to become aware. And awareness changes everything, because when you become aware, you stop being surprised by your own behavior. You start seeing it coming. You start noticing the early signals. You notice the tightness in your chest before you argue. You notice the restless energy before you scroll. You notice the urge to prove yourself before you over-explain. You notice the fatigue before you reach for comfort food. That noticing is a form of power, and power doesn't have to be loud. Power can be a pause. Here's a simple Stoic method that works like mindfulness in daily life. When you feel an emotion rising, label it quietly: anger, anxiety, shame, jealousy, restlessness. You're not fighting it, you're naming it. And when you name it, you create distance. You become the observer instead of the emotion. This is important because emotions often lie by making themselves feel urgent. They say, react now. Mindfulness says, notice now. And notice is different than obey. Seneca wrote about anger as a kind of temporary madness. That's not an insult. It's a warning. When you're angry, your mind becomes narrow. When you're anxious, your mind becomes catastrophic. When you're ashamed, your mind becomes harsh. Mindfulness is the practice of not trusting the mind at its worst moments. You observe the storm instead of steering the ship from inside the storm. Now, there's an even deeper benefit. Mindfulness helps you let go of the need to escape your own inner world. Many people stay busy and distracted because silence forces them to feel things they don't want to feel. But the new person you're becoming can sit with discomfort. Not forever, not dramatically, but long enough to understand it. And that's where healing begins. Because if you can sit with your emotions, you don't need to run from them into old habits. So here's the if. Then that makes step 9 immediate. If you feel the urge to do something that you know pulls you backward, scrolling, procrastinating, overeating, reacting, over-explaining, then pause for 10 seconds and name what you're feeling. Just name it. Then ask one question. What am I trying to avoid right now? That question often reveals the real issue. And once you see the real issue, you can choose a better response. And a second, if, then that strengthens the practice. If you make a mistake, then you don't punish yourself. You study it. You write down the trigger and the emotion that came before the behavior. Because every mistake is a map, and maps help you navigate next time. Over time, mindfulness turns your life from a series of reactions into a series of choices. You become less impulsive, not because you became rigid, but because you became conscious. You start living from awareness instead of autopilot. And once you have awareness, the final step becomes possible in a deep way. Letting go of the past, not as denial, but as release. Because you can't become new while carrying an old identity as a permanent sentence. 10. Let go of the past. Release the old story without erasing the lesson. Have you ever tried to change, truly tried, and then right when you start building momentum, a memory shows up like a shadow and quietly says, "Who do you think you are?" Not always as words. Sometimes it's a feeling, a heaviness, a flash of a past mistake, a moment you're still ashamed of, a version of you that you don't respect. And suddenly, the future feels less possible. Not because you don't want it, but because the past feels like a permanent label. That's what the past does when you hold it the wrong way. It stops being a teacher and becomes a prison. Stoicism has a clean perspective here. You cannot control what happened. You can control what you do with it now. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should not waste the present suffering about the past or the future. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because the only place character can be built is the present moment. Epictetus would call it simple. The past is not in your control. So clinging to it as if you can change it is a form of mental slavery. It keeps you tied to what cannot be moved. But letting go does not mean pretending it didn't happen. It means you stop paying interest on it. Most people don't just remember their mistakes. They relive them, they replay them, they punish themselves for them. They turn them into identity statements. I'm the kind of person who ruins things. I always mess up. I'm not worthy. I don't deserve good things. And if you carry those statements, you will unconsciously sabotage anything that contradicts them. Because the mind prefers consistency, even when consistency is painful. So, the real work of letting go is not forgetting the past. It's releasing the story you attach to it. The story that says the past is proof you can't change. The story that says you're permanently stained. The story that says your mistakes are the truest version of you. They're not. They're evidence of what happens when you are untrained, unhealed, distracted, afraid, or overwhelmed. And now you're training. Now you're learning. Now you're becoming aware. Now you're building standards. That means the past is not your identity. It's your starting point. Seneca had a way of talking about time that makes this even clearer. The most precious thing you own is the present, and people throw it away. They throw it away by drowning in regret. They throw it away by living inside if only. And if only is a seductive poison because it feels like reflection, but it's actually rumination. It doesn't change anything. It only keeps you tied to pain. So let's make this practical, because forgive yourself can sound like a nice phrase that doesn't land if you're carrying real shame. Forgiveness is not a mood. It's a decision to stop using self-hatred as a management tool. Many people secretly believe self-hatred is what keeps them from repeating mistakes. They think, if I stop being harsh, I'll become careless. But look at your life honestly. Has harshness made you free, or has it made you tired and stuck? Self-hatred doesn't create discipline, it creates collapse. Real change comes from responsibility without cruelty. So what does responsibility without cruelty look like? It looks like this. I did that. It was wrong. I learned something. I'm not doing it again, and I refuse to keep bleeding for it. That's the sentence of a new person. And letting go also means you stop visiting the old place emotionally. You stop checking the past like it's a scoreboard. You stop measuring your worth by your worst moment. You stop letting old mistakes define the tone of your future, because you can't build a new identity while rehearsing an old shame. Now, there's another side to letting go. Forgiving other people. Not because they deserve it, because you deserve peace. Holding resentment is like gripping a hot stone. You think it proves you were wronged, but the stone doesn't feel your proof. Only your hand burns. Stoicism would say, you don't need to deny what happened, but you also don't need to let it sit inside your mind rent-free. Sometimes the hardest release isn't, I forgive them, it's, I release my need to keep reliving it. You can release without reconciling. You can move on without reopening the door. That's not weakness, that's control. So how do you actually do this in daily life? You practice returning to the present. When a painful memory comes up, you don't panic. You don't wrestle it. You acknowledge it, and you redirect to the next correct action. Because the present is where your power lives. The present is where you keep promises. The present is where you build skill. The present is where you become the person you said you are. And here's the part people underestimate. Letting go is easier when you have a direction. If your life is empty, the past becomes entertainment. If your life has purpose, the past becomes a lesson, then it fades. So letting go is not only emotional work, it's building work. The more you build, the less the past controls you. Now let's make this step concrete with an if-then. If a memory triggers shame, then do 3 things. Name what you learned, remind yourself what you do differently now, and take one small action that matches your new identity. Because the fastest way to release shame is not to argue with it. It's to create evidence that you're not that person anymore. And if a memory triggers regret, then do one thing, redirect to repair. Not always with other people. Sometimes repair is simply living differently today. The past can't be corrected directly, but it can be redeemed through consistent, present actions. That's what redemption really is, sustained proof. So when the mind says, remember when you failed, you answer, yes, and look what I'm building now. Not as a slogan, as a reality. And that's how the past loses its grip. Not because you forced yourself to think positive, but because you stopped living under the old story. You become the new person by doing new things, with new standards, in the present, until the present becomes your identity. And then one day you realize something quietly astonishing. You're not haunted the same way anymore. The memories still exist, but they don't own you. They don't steer your decisions. They don't define your self-respect. They're just part of the road behind you. And you're walking forward. You might not feel like a new person right away. And that's okay. Real change rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives like a quiet shift in how you respond to life. A calmer pause where you used to panic. A cleaner decision where you used to bargain. A smaller relapse that doesn't turn into a full collapse. A day where you keep a promise to yourself without needing anyone to clap for you. If you listen closely, that's what becoming new really is. Not a dramatic reinvention, but a steady return to a version of you that feels honest and strong and reliable. Because at the end of the day, the goal was never to impress anyone. The goal was to live with yourself in peace, to look in the mirror and recognize someone you respect, someone who doesn't need perfect conditions to act, someone who can handle discomfort without running, someone who can fail, learn, adjust, and keep going without turning it into a personal tragedy. And if you take one thing from everything we talked about, let it be this. Your life changes when your standards become real, and your standards become real when you keep them in small moments. The moment nobody sees. The moment you could easily choose comfort. The moment you could easily say, it doesn't matter. Those moments matter more than the big ones, because they are the ones that build identity. So don't try to carry all of this at once. Carry one step, one decision, one habit you can repeat. If you want a simple way to choose, pick the one you keep avoiding, the one that makes you slightly uncomfortable, because that's usually the doorway you've been walking past for years. And when you feel yourself slipping back into the old story, don't panic, don't attack yourself. Just come back to the present and take the next correct action, even if it's small, especially if it's small. That's how you stop living in cycles and start living in direction. If this landed for you, take a quiet second after this ends and ask yourself one honest question. What would the person I want to become do today, in the very next hour? Then do that one thing, cleanly, without drama. And if you want more episodes like this, more practical Stoic clarity, more self-discipline that actually works in real life, explore the rest of the content and keep walking with me.